You ever have a moment that stops you dead in your tracks, where a single sentence changes everything? I was 19, standing in my best friend Jake's kitchen, when his mom, Claire, looked at me with eyes that didn't belong in that moment. "I was hoping you'd come by today," she said, her voice soft, like she'd been rehearsing it. My stomach twisted. This wasn't just a casual comment. It felt like a confession, like she'd been waiting for me, not Jake, not anyone else, just me. I froze, my hand halfway to the fridge, the hum of it the only sound in the room. Claire was 42, with this quiet grace that made you notice her without trying. She wasn't supposed to say things like that. Not to me. Not when Jake was upstairs, clueless, playing video games. I'd been coming to their house for years, ever since Jake and I were kids. Claire was always there, warm, kind, the kind of mom who made you feel like you belong. But lately, something had shifted. A glance that lingered too long. A smile that felt private. And now this? My heart was racing, and not in a good way. Was I imagining it? Was I reading too much into her words? Or was there something real behind them, something dangerous, something that could ruin everything? I wanted to laugh it off, to pretend it was nothing, but the air felt heavy, like we were standing on the edge of something we couldn't come back from. What do you do when someone you're not supposed to think about says something you're not supposed to hear? Do you run? Do you stay? Or do you let yourself fall into the moment, knowing it might burn everything down? Let me take you back to the beginning, because this didn't start with that one sentence. It started years ago, when I was just a kid who didn't know better. Jake and I met in 5th grade, bonded over sneaking comic books into class and pretending we were superheroes. His house was my second home. His mom, Claire, was the kind of person who made you feel seen. She'd ask about your day, really listen, and always had this way of making you feel like you mattered. She was the mom I wished I had, not that mine was bad, but Claire was different. She had this quiet strength, this way of carrying herself that made you want to be around her. By the time I was 19, things at home were rough. My dad had left a couple of years earlier, and my mom was working double shifts to keep us afloat. Jake's house was my escape. I'd show up after school, sometimes without even texting Jake, and Claire would always be there, in the kitchen or the living room, reading a book or folding laundry. She'd smile, ask how I was holding up, and I'd tell her things I didn't tell anyone else. Not deep secrets, just stuff. How I was failing math. How I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. She'd listen, nod, and say something small but perfect, like, "You'll figure it out. You're smarter than you think." It wasn't like I was looking for anything. I wasn't that guy. I had a girlfriend, Sarah, who I'd been with for a year. She was great, funny, sweet, the kind of person you bring home to meet your mom. But there was something about Claire that started creeping into my thoughts. Not in a loud way, not at first. It was little things. The way her laugh sounded when I made a dumb joke. The way she'd brush her hair behind her ear when she was thinking. I'd catch myself watching her, then look away, ashamed. She was Jake's mom. She was married, even if her husband, Mark, was always away for work. I told myself it was nothing, just a stupid crush I'd outgrow. But then there were moments, small, fleeting ones, where I'd catch her looking at me, too. Not like a mom looks at her kid's friend. Like she saw me. Really saw me. That summer, Jake got a job at a local record store, so he was gone most afternoons. I'd still go over to his house, telling myself it was habit, but deep down, I knew I was hoping to see Claire. We'd talk, nothing crazy, just about life, music, books. She'd tell me about her college days, how she wanted to be a writer but gave it up when she had Jake. I'd tell her about my dreams, how I wanted to get out of our small town but didn't know how. It felt safe, but there was this undercurrent, this unspoken thing that made my chest tight. I started noticing how she'd light up when I walked in, how her voice softened when it was just us. I told myself I was crazy, that I was projecting my own feelings onto her. But then came that day in the kitchen, when she said those words. "I was hoping you'd come by today." and everything changed. That sentence hit me like a punch I didn't see coming. I stood there, hands still on the fridge handle, trying to process it. Claire was leaning against the counter, her coffee mug cradled in her hands, her eyes locked on mine. There was no mistaking it. This wasn't a casual comment. Her voice had this weight, this quiet intensity that made my skin prickle. I laughed, awkward and forced, and said, "Oh, yeah? Why's that?" I was hoping she'd brush it off, say something about needing help with groceries or wanting to hear about my day. But she didn't. She just smiled, this small, almost sad smile, and said, "I just like it when you're here." My heart was pounding so hard I thought she could hear it. I mumbled something about needing to grab a drink and turned back to the fridge, my face burning. I could feel her watching me, and it took everything not to look back. This was Jake's mom. Jake, my best friend since we were kids, the guy who'd been there for me through everything. And here I was, standing in his kitchen, feeling things I had no right to feel. Guilt clawed at me, but so did something else, something dangerous, something that made me want to stay in that moment forever. I grabbed a soda, popped it open, and took a long sip, trying to act normal. "Where's Jake?" I asked, my voice tighter than I meant it to be. She set her mug down, her fingers lingering on the handle. "Upstairs. He's been glued to that game all morning." Her tone was light, but her eyes didn't leave me. I nodded, staring at the floor, willing myself to say something normal, to break whatever this was. But before I could, she stepped closer, not a lot, just enough to make the air feel thinner. "You don't have to rush off," she said. "We could talk. Like we used to." Like we used to. Those words hung there, heavy with meaning I didn't want to unpack. Because our talks had changed, hadn't they? They weren't just friendly anymore. There was this thread of something else, something that made my palms sweat and my thoughts spiral. I wanted to tell her I had to go, that Sarah was waiting for me, that this was wrong. But I didn't. I stayed, leaning against the counter across from her, the soda can cold against my hand. "Yeah, okay," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "What's on your mind?" She hesitated, like she was weighing her words, deciding how far to go. Then she started talking, about her life, her marriage, how Mark was always gone, how she felt invisible sometimes. I listened, nodding, trying to focus on her words and not the same way her eyes kept finding mine. She told me about a fight she'd had with Mark, how he didn't understand her anymore, how she felt like she was losing herself. "You ever feel like you're living someone else's life?" she asked, her voice raw. I nodded, even though I wasn't sure I did. I just wanted her to keep talking, to keep looking at me like that. The conversation stretched on, and I don't know how long we stood there, minutes, maybe an hour. Jake was still upstairs, oblivious, the faint sound of his game drifting down. Every word we said felt like a step closer to something we couldn't undo. I told her about Sarah, how things were good but sometimes felt empty. She listened, her face soft, her eyes searching mine like she was looking for something she'd lost. And then she said it again, quieter this time. "I'm glad you're here." My breath caught, and for a second, I thought about closing the distance between us, about saying something I couldn't take back. But I didn't. I couldn't. Not yet. The guilt was suffocating, but so was the pull I felt toward her. I kept thinking about Jake, about Sarah, about how this could ruin everything. But there was this other part of me, the part that didn't care, that wanted to know what would happen if I let this go further. I hated that part of me, but it was there, loud and insistent. Claire must have seen it on my face, because she reached out, her hand brushing mine for just a second before she pulled back. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I shouldn't have said that." But it was too late. The line had been crossed, and we both knew it. The days after that kitchen moment were a blur of confusion and obsession. I couldn't stop thinking about Claire, her voice, her eyes, the way her hand felt against mine for that fleeting second. I told myself to stay away, to stop going to Jake's house, but it was like I was on autopilot. I'd find excuses, homework, video games, just hanging out, but really, I was hoping to see her. And she was always there, like she was waiting too. Our conversations got longer, deeper, more dangerous. We'd talk about everything and nothing, music, dreams, regrets. But there was always this undercurrent, this unspoken question of what we were doing. Jake didn't notice a thing. He was caught up in his job, his games, his own world. But Sarah did. She started asking why I was so distracted, why I didn't answer her texts as fast as I used to. I'd lie, say I was stressed about school, but the truth was eating me alive. I was falling for someone I had no right to want, someone who was supposed to be off limits. Claire wasn't just Jake's mom anymore. She was the person I thought about when I couldn't sleep, the one I wanted to talk to when everything else felt heavy. One afternoon, I showed up at their house when I knew Jake was at work. I told myself it was to grab a book I'd lent him, but that was a lie. Claire answered the door, her hair loose, her smile soft and knowing. "I was hoping you'd come by," she said, and there it was again, that phrase that turned my world upside down. She invited me in, and we sat on the couch, closer than we should have. She told me about a poem she'd written, something she hadn't shown anyone in years. She read it to me, her voice trembling, and it was like she was handing me a piece of her soul. When she finished, I didn't know what to say, so I just said, "It's beautiful." She looked at me, her eyes wet, and said, "You're the only one who gets it." That was the moment I knew we were in too deep. I wanted to tell her to stop, to tell myself to stop, but I couldn't. We started finding ways to be alone, small moments, stolen conversations. She'd text me, just little things like, "You left your jacket here." But it felt like more. I'd text back, keeping it neutral, but my heart would race every time her name lit up my phone. The guilt was constant, a weight I carried everywhere, but it wasn't enough to make me stop. I started pulling away from Sarah, from Jake, from everyone. Claire was all I could see. Then came the night everything almost fell apart. Jake invited me over for a movie, but when I got there, he was passed out on the couch, exhausted from a double shift. Claire was in the kitchen, cleaning up, and when she saw me, she smiled like I was the only person in the world. We talked, quieter this time, careful not to wake Jake. She told me about a dream she'd had, about running away, starting over somewhere new. "Would you ever do that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't answer, but my silence said everything. She reached for my hand, and this time, she didn't pull back. Her fingers laced with mine, and for a moment, nothing else existed. But then Jake stirred, and we sprang apart, my heart hammering like I'd been caught stealing. I left that night, promising myself I'd end it, whatever it was. But I couldn't. The next time I saw her, she apologized, said we needed to be careful, but her eyes told a different story. We were trapped in this dance, both of us knowing it was wrong, both of us too weak to stop. I started wondering what would happen if we gave in, if we let ourselves cross that final line. Would it destroy everything? Or would it be worth it? The tension was unbearable, but it was also addictive. I didn't know how much longer I could keep pretending. The weeks that followed were a tightrope walk between longing and shame. Every time I saw Claire, it was like the air got thinner, like we were both holding our breath, waiting for something to break. I'd catch her watching me when she thought I wasn't looking, her eyes soft and searching, like she was trying to figure out what this was as much as I was. I started noticing things I hadn't before, the way her hands moved when she talked, nervous but deliberate, the way she'd pause before saying my name, like it carried a weight she didn't want to admit. I'd lie awake at night, replaying our conversations, dissecting every word, every look, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. But it wasn't. I knew it wasn't. Sarah and I were drifting further apart, and it was my fault. She'd asked me what was wrong, her voice sharp with worry, and I'd snap back, defensive, because I didn't know how to tell her the truth. How do you tell your girlfriend you're haunted by someone you're not supposed to want? How do you admit you're betraying your best friend without even touching the person you're betraying him for? Jake was still oblivious, thank God, but that only made it worse. Every time he'd laugh or slap my shoulder or talk about our plans for the future, it was like a knife twisting in my gut. I was lying to him, to Sarah, to myself. But Claire was the one person I couldn't lie to. Not anymore. Our moments alone became more frequent, more reckless. One day, I showed up at their house unannounced, my heart pounding as I knocked on the door. Claire answered, wearing a faded sweater, her hair pulled back in a messy bun. She didn't say anything at first, just stepped aside to let me in. We sat in the living room, the TV off, the house quiet except for the faint hum of the air conditioner. She asked me about my day, but her voice was different, tighter, like she was holding something back. I told her about a fight I'd had with my mom, how I felt like I was failing everyone. She listened, her eyes never leaving mine, and when I finished, she said, "You're not failing me." Those words hit me harder than they should have. I wanted to ask what she meant, but I was too afraid of the answer. Instead, I just sat there, my hands clenched in my lap, trying to ignore the way my pulse raced when she leaned closer. We talked for hours that day, about nothing and everything, and when I left, she hugged me, a quick, careful hug, but it lingered in my mind for days. I could still feel the warmth of her arms, the way her breath caught when we pulled apart. I started avoiding Jake's invitations, making excuses about being busy, because every time I saw him, I saw her, too. I knew I was crossing lines I couldn't uncross, but the pull was stronger than my willpower. Claire started texting me more, not just about jackets or books, but about her thoughts, her fears, her dreams. One night she sent me a message that just said, "I wish things were different." I stared at it for an hour, my thumb hovering over the reply button, but I didn't know what to say. What could I say? That I wished the same thing? That I was drowning in guilt but couldn't stop thinking about her? I didn't reply, but the next time I saw her, she didn't bring it up. She just looked at me, her eyes full of questions we were both too scared to ask. The tension kept building, like a storm gathering on the horizon, and I knew it couldn't last. Something had to give. It all came crashing down one evening when Jake was out with friends. I went to their house, telling myself it was to talk, to set boundaries, to end this before it went too far. Claire was waiting, like she knew I'd come. We sat on the porch, the air cool, the street quiet. She looked at me, her eyes full of everything we hadn't said. "I don't know how to stop this," she whispered. I wanted to tell her we had to, that this was tearing me apart, but instead, I leaned in, and so did she. Our lips were inches apart when the headlights of Mark's car swept across the porch. We froze, pulling back just in time as he pulled into the driveway. Mark didn't suspect a thing, but that moment was a wake-up call. Claire and I didn't speak for weeks after that. I threw myself into fixing things with Sarah, pretending nothing had happened, but the guilt was a shadow I couldn't shake. Claire texted me once, a single word. "Sorry." I didn't reply. Jake never found out, and I'm grateful for that, but I lost something that night, maybe my innocence, maybe my sense of who I was. Claire and I never crossed that final line, but we came close enough to know what it cost us. The weeks turned into months, and I saw her less and less. Jake got a new job, moved out, and I stopped going to their house. Sarah and I broke up eventually, not because of Claire, but because I wasn't the same person anymore. I look at my phone sometimes, at that one-word text from Claire, and wonder what might have happened if Mark's car hadn't pulled up. Would we have given in? Would it have destroyed everything? Or would it have been worth it? I'll never know, and maybe that's the worst part. The what-ifs that keep you up at night, the moments you can't take back, the feelings you can't unfeel. Have you ever been caught in a moment you knew was wrong but couldn't walk away from? Hit that like button if this story hit you hard, and share your own story in the comments. I read every single one. Subscribe for more real, raw stories about the lines we almost cross. You never know when the next one might feel a little too close to home. 22.